Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So a question that sometimes comes up is regarding close combat weapons in different periods of history. In the modern day and age, the personal sidearms in military spheres are generally a pistol of various kinds. However, knives and daggers and other types of bladed weapons are still sometimes used as close quarter, usually covert, hand-to-hand weapons. And in fact, the bayonet is still of course issued to most militaries, most mainstream militaries around the world, including British, American and French, German and so on. And whilst different militaries do or don't do bayonet training to a serious degree, there have been occasions in relatively recent history, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, where bayonets and knives have been used, both used in close quarter combat, or indeed just used as essentially as a threat of close quarter combat. So fixing bayonets and charging in the case of Iraqi engagements. However, in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of a bladed weapon as opposed to a pistol, there are some obvious points, some obvious strengths that one has over the other, but there are also some less obvious strengths and weaknesses to each of those weapon sets. And so I thought it would be interesting to make a little video about it, but at least for this video, looking at the 19th century context and seeing how a revolver, for example, compares to a sword as a close quarter combat weapon. So first up, we're going to look at the advantages of the sword, and then we're going to look at the advantages of the pistol, and hopefully sum up with something that gives some kind of logical conclusion to the comparison. So first up, a very obvious example of an advantage that the sword has over the revolver is that it doesn't rely on ammunition. It is a self-contained weapon in itself. It doesn't require external components to make it into a weapon to offend and defend. So it's very clearly never going to run out of ammunition, because you hit with it, you strike and you thrust, and the power comes from your body. So that is the first very clear advantage of, even in a modern context, a knife or a bayonet, is that it doesn't run out of ammunition. And of course, many times, both in the modern day and in history, when the sword or the bayonet is used, it is very often because the ammunition for the firearm has been expended. Now, in a previous video I've made on this topic, or a related topic, some people pointed out that during the American Civil War, some people who used revolvers carried numerous revolvers, sometimes a pair or sometimes even more. There are records of people carrying 4 revolvers and perhaps even more than that. And in the case of things like the Remington 1858, which can quite easily and quickly change cylinders in the revolver, actually changing that out so you can quickly reload. And obviously with a modern pistol you can achieve very quick reload times with magazines, and you can carry many magazines. You can carry as many as you can physically fit on your person, of course. Usually I think in law enforcement people usually only probably have 1 spare clip, and maybe in military situations maybe they would carry several magazines for their assault rifle and maybe 1 spare clip for their pistol or something like that. But clearly you could carry many spare clips. However, in a 19th century context, which is what we're looking at here, it was generally not practical to carry lots of spare cylinders for a revolver, or to carry lots of revolvers. As in recent videos I've done talking about what is practical to carry around with yourself, it's just not practical to carry lots of revolvers. You can carry 2. You can carry 2 fully loaded revolvers. That gives you, depending on the type of revolver, usually gives you 10 or 12 shots. But it's generally not possible to carry more than that. And also, as I mentioned in my previous video, you have to remember that of those 10 or 12 shots, that's assuming you're carrying 2 revolvers fully loaded, only a certain number of those shots will actually have an effect on the target. So you might have to shoot one target numerous times, and in addition to that, numerous of your shots may indeed miss the target or have very little effect on the target. So don't think about every bullet as being a sort of death-dealing factor in the equation, because the fact of the matter is, in whether it's law enforcement or combat in war or skirmishing, then skirmishing or battles or anything like this, it usually doesn't equate to that. Usually 6 shots usually only equates to one dead person if you're lucky, or if they're unlucky, depending how you look at it. So very obvious advantage of the sword is it doesn't run out of ammunition. So related to the point that the sword doesn't run out of ammunition is also the point that it therefore cannot jam. Now, the sword can jam in the sense that it can fail. Swords in history have been recorded as bending or breaking or even being blunt or otherwise becoming less efficient than you would hope they would be. However, assuming the sword doesn't break, it cannot jam. It's a simple sharpened bar of steel. So in that sense it's mechanically more simple than a pistol, and certainly if we go back again, we're talking about the 19th century context here. 19th century pistols, particularly the muzzle loading ones, became more reliable from the brass cartridge onward, but certainly the early revolvers of the type that I show here were known to fail through a number of different ways. I won't go into the details of that. I'll probably do future videos where I talk more about the actual firearms in more depth, but there were various different ways that the firearm could fail in use, and there's many recorded incidences from history where pistols, revolvers and other forms of early pistol did not have the effect that the person using it would have hoped. Obviously sometimes to do with missing, sometimes to do with their skill, but very often to do with mechanical failure. Mechanical failure with swords is less of a factor simply because it's mechanically a much more simple object. Another big advantage of the sword, which often gets overlooked when people are doing direct comparisons of sword versus pistol, and this could even apply to a modern context, incidentally, perhaps for the knife versus the pistol, is that a sword can parry, can defend, and very often the person who is using the sword or the pistol is trying to defend themselves from attack, and that attack could be someone with a baseball bat, or could be someone in a building that they've gone into who's literally jumped on top of them and started grappling with them, or it could be someone who's swinging a sword at them or thrusting a bayonet at them. Now the simple fact is, if someone's close enough to hit you with an object, be it a sword, a bayonet, a baseball bat, or their fists, whilst a pistol can unload into them and ultimately incapacitate or kill them, it cannot in itself protect you from those blows hitting you. Now if they're offending you with something like a sharp tulwar or a bayonet, then very clearly having a sword that is able to defend and parry those attacks is a really big advantage over the pistol. The pistol cannot do that. You cannot realistically block incoming blows, cuts and thrusts with a pistol. So a big advantage in the 19th century context of the sword is that you can defend yourself, and obviously in British colonial history, for example looking in India or Afghanistan or South Africa in the case of the Zulu Wars, where sometimes the people using the swords, be they cavalrymen or infantry officers, were carrying a sword, it was very important that they were able to use that sword to defend themselves from incoming attacks. You cannot do that with a pistol. All you can do is attack back, and very often that will result in 2 wounded people or possibly even 2 dead people. Additionally, mentioning the modern context again, a knife, something in your hand, by using your arms and your hands you can block. Okay, you cannot do this only with the pistol in itself. You can, yes, you can block with your arm and fire back with a pistol, and there's an interesting 19th century parallel to that with von Tempsky's Rangers during the New Zealand land wars. In the 1860s, he actually equipped his Rangers with a Bowie knife and a revolver. So they used the Bowie knife to defend themselves from the attack of the Maori using a club or an axe or a spear or whatever. so they could defend themselves with the Bowie knife and then shoot with the revolver. So it's quite similar to using the sword and the revolver together, but using a Bowie knife and a revolver instead. The Bowie knife, of course, being easier to transport, easier to wear and lighter to carry. Another potential major advantage of the cold steel is that it's able, of course, to offend someone pretty much silently. Now, this is a point that, in a way, I feel that perhaps too much is made of. Yes, knives have been used covertly in, you know, all of history essentially, but particularly famously in the Second World War, of course, commandos, the early forms of the SAS and such like, did use commando daggers to take out sentries silently and this kind of thing. So when people think of the knife in modern usage, they often think of the famous use of the knife in covert operations. But equally, the dagger, the trench dagger, and indeed trench clubs and swords and spades and shovels and axes and other things like this were used in World War I in trench raid fighting. One of the aspects of using a hand weapon like a sword or a knife or even a tomahawk or whatever in close combat is that it doesn't flag up your position in terms of noise, but also it doesn't create any flash really, and it doesn't create any smoke. Something that people often forget about firearms until relatively modern times is that they create quite a flash, a lot of noise and some smoke. And before smokeless cartridges they create a lot of smoke. So in actual fact, not only is it a case of necessarily being silent, but just being not that noisy, because guns are really, really noisy. Even if you're skirmishing in woodland, for example, if you're using hand weapons, for example bayonets, if you go in with bayonet point and take out a load of the enemy with bayonets and they don't fire, they don't get the chance to fire at you, then you've taken out that position and the whole rest of the enemy are not really alerted to where you are, because you've taken them out. You may have made some noise, there'll be probably some screaming, probably some clattering and bashing of equipment, but it's nothing like the amount of noise and flash and smoke that you get from firearms being discharged, be it rifles or pistols or anything else. So noise, light and smoke are something to note as well. A major advantage that things like swords and knives have over firearms is that in a confused and sort of pell-mell situation where you know, things are flying around and people are really you know, going for it, a typical combat situation, quite simply, people's accuracy with firearms absolutely plummets. Okay, a lot of self-defense pistol training these days is taught at pretty much point-blank range, using the pistol essentially a bit like a knife, and having the gun very close to the body here and shooting at centre of mass. A hand weapon, such as a knife or a sword, doesn't really need to be aimed. Yes, of course, you aim at the person who's next to you, but it's actually relatively difficult to miss someone with a sword. If someone's standing right in front of you, the most difficult thing is parrying their blows and finding an opening to get a blow in. But when you do see an opening to get a blow in, it's very easy to actually land your blade, either with point or edge, onto their body. Okay? Whereas a pistol, in a very chaotic situation, it's much more difficult to actually get it pointed in the right direction, to actually get that bullet into a place that's going to incapacitate your opponent. Okay, so quite simply, and we'll talk about the advantages of the firearm, or specifically of the pistol, in a minute. One of the advantages of the hand weapon is it doesn't need to be aimed, and it's quite difficult, relatively to the firearm speaking, it's quite difficult to miss. With shooting weapons, be it bows, crossbows, pistols or whatever, it's quite easy to miss. And remember, if you've got your 5 or 6 shots in your pistol, every miss, it's like that never existed. Misses are irrelevant, okay, in terms of removing the enemy threat. You can't defend yourself with the pistol, you can only shoot back. So if you don't incapacitate the opponent with the shot back, you've achieved nothing with it apart from making lots of flashing and loud noise and a bit of smoke. Okay? Finally, another advantage of the hand weapon, which again I think probably gets overlooked by and large, is that your chance of collateral damage, that is wounding either innocent people that you don't want to wound or people on your own team, people on your own side, is much, much smaller with hand weapons than it is with shooting weapons. Very simply, if you shoot someone at close range, there's a fairly large chance with most types of pistols, certainly modern ones and historically as well, although perhaps slightly less with lower powered black powder weapons, that that bullet will pass through the part of your body that you, the part of their body that you hit, and that bullet will carry on travelling. So there's always a risk that that bullet, and of course if you miss, the bullet will definitely carry on travelling. So if you hit them or don't hit them, there's always a percentage chance that you're going to hit someone you didn't want to hit. It's relatively speaking pretty difficult to accidentally hit someone with a bladed weapon who's on your team or a completely innocent person in the background. Okay, so from that sense, although it's obviously you have to get close to someone to offend them with a hand weapon, for that, partly for that reason, and partly because when you hit someone with a hand weapon, the hand weapon doesn't carry on travelling for a distance beyond. For those reasons, you're far less likely to do collateral damage with hand weapons than you are with missile weapons. Kind of obvious, but it's worth mentioning. So to sum up, what I see as the main two advantages of the sword over the revolver or pistol in the 19th century context is, number one, it doesn't run out. It can keep going for as long as you can, and assuming it doesn't break or malfunction in some other way. Okay, but secondly, and I think this is massively overlooked because people tend to think about only offensive and they don't think about defensive, is that it can defend. Okay, and certainly people who defend the kind of US Civil War ethos of carrying lots of revolvers, that worked in an American situation because the enemy were also carrying firearms. The simple fact of the matter is that no American army in the 19th century really had to deal with opponents who had lots of hand weapons who wanted to come to close range. Yes, the American Indian nations did that to some extent. However, the firepower advantage of the American sort of military was always so, generally speaking, so overwhelming. Of course, famously at Little Bighorn that wasn't the case, and they got pretty much well, they got entirely wiped out. But the fact of the matter is that nations such as France and Britain, who fought in colonial wars against opponents who had lots of hand weapons and wanted to bring it to a hand-to-hand fight, obviously for Britain the main example being in the Sikh Wars, the Indian Mutiny, some of the Afghan Wars, the Zulu Wars, and so on and so forth. The opponents often were determined to bring it to hand-to-hand range, and at that range having a weapon that could parry was very, very important. And you simply cannot parry, you can't in essence defend yourself with a pistol. All you can do is offend the attacker such that they no longer become a risk. And that's at point blank range, that's a very risky game to play if someone's trying to bayonet you, or if several people are trying to bayonet you, because number one, your gun's going to run out of ammunition at some point, number two, you might miss, and number three, there's nothing stopping their attack from hitting you, apart from timing, really. Okay, so there we go. The two main points for me in favour of the sword in a 19th century context are, number one, the most important, it can defend, it can physically defend, and number two, it can never run out of the ability to offend and defend. It doesn't run out of ammunition. It will keep going for as long as you do. So now we will move on to looking at the advantages of the pistol. Hi guys, so we're talking about the 19th century revolver and pistol here. So very clearly for a lot of people, when it came along, the revolver in the late 1840s and then the 1850s predominantly, it was kind of seen as almost a kind of magical weapon that would cure all of their woes and, you know, replace the sword and probably replace the bayonet and kind of spell the end of hand-to-hand combat. And very simply, it didn't, for a number of reasons that I've spoken about in a previous video and I'm touching upon in this one. So what we're looking at here specifically is the 19th century revolver, and what were the strengths of it? Well, very clearly the most obvious strength of a missile weapon over a hand weapon is that you can offend your enemy from far away. Okay, so that needs to be stated right at the beginning. The advantage of this is if I see an enemy over there, I can take aim and shoot, and if I hit them, they will hopefully, if I'm a good shot and if my bullet has the effect I want it to, drop down dead. And that's the end of that threat. Whereas if I was using a sword or a knife, I would have to go close to them, which would be more risky for me, and it would take a longer amount of time. So again, you've got essentially a time advantage, a safety in distance, and the fact that I can offend someone who I couldn't otherwise reach. It could be someone who's the other side of a wall, someone who's inside a building, someone who's crossing a bridge, or whatever. So very clearly, reach and therefore time are big advantages that the pistol or revolver, or in fact any other missile weapon, has over the hand weapon. The next very important advantage that the revolver, or at least perceived advantage that the revolver or pistol has over the sword or bayonet or knife, is that, and again, I'll reiterate that I said perceived, is that the wound given by the bullet is generally more fatal than the wound given by the bayonet or sword. Now, whether that's true or not is a kind of complicated question, but certainly in the 19th century it was perceived that getting shot in your chest, for example, by a revolver was generally seen as worse for your health than getting thrust through your chest by a sword, and each of those were worse for you if you were the one wounded than getting slashed across the chest with a sword. So the general perception in the 19th century was that cuts were the most superficial of those three wounds, then thrusts were the next most serious, and then bullet wounds were the most serious. Now, why should that be the case? Well, partly because of the nature of the wound that's caused. Cuts they can of course sever arteries, which can lead to death, and they can lop off parts of your body, can cause death by blood loss or shock to the system. You can pass it. All sorts of bad things can happen from cuts. However, the majority of cuts don't enter the body very deeply, and if you get medical attention, and remember this is the 19th century that we're focusing on in this video, if you get medical attention to a cut, it was the most easy wound for a 19th century surgeon to deal with. There was a long history of dealing with superficial cuts. It's shallow, so it's easier to clean, it's less likely to fester and get a nasty infection in there. And of course, the shallower it is, the less likely it is to injure the internal organs or brain or other things that are a little bit deeper down in the body. A thrust was generally seen as more fatal, and I think statistically probably was more fatal because of course it went deeper into the body, was harder to treat, and was more likely to cause internal bleeding, which they really couldn't do anything about. External bleeding you can stop, internal bleeding they couldn't really stop. Okay, so a thrust into an internal organ, very bad news in the 19th century. A gunshot wound into your body is pretty much like a thrust, but it's more messy. And in a 19th century context, they really weren't that good at dealing with internal damage, like I've mentioned in regards to thrusts. But it was even worse with bullets, because number one, you've got a foreign body still in the wound, you've got to remove the bullet. Often the bullet would push in other materials, such as bits of clothing, so you'd get a patch of the clothing would be carried in with the bullet or the ball. Additionally, there might be some material that other than the bullet that had come from the gun, so maybe a bit of wadding or something as well that would enter, or certainly bits of powder and grit and dirt. But additionally, once you've removed all of that dirt, the way that the bullet or the ball interacts with the inside of the person's body is much more messy than a blade. A blade goes clean in and clean out, generally speaking. Even if it goes clean in, twists and comes out, it's still a relatively clean wound. Whereas a bullet is a messy, blunt, trauma, torn hole through the body, and is much more difficult to stop bleeding, much more difficult to seal up, and is more likely to do more damage to the body. Okay? Another major advantage that the pistol or revolver has over the sword, at least, maybe not the knife or the dagger, but over the sword, is that, and this gets overlooked a lot, is it's much easier to carry. We know that later in the 19th century, in areas where swords were still generally speaking seen as serious weapons, very often if people weren't expecting imminent action or a reason to wear a sword, they would nevertheless still carry a revolver or pistol. I mean, for the very simple reason that you can carry one of these around and kind of not notice it's there. It's much like a knife. It's not big, it's not particularly heavy, it doesn't flap around, it doesn't get tangled with your legs. Once it's loaded, it's loaded. You don't have to carry extra ammunition, and historically most people don't seem to have done. They just loaded this thing and carried it around. So you know you've got your 5 or 6 shots and you're good for those. Hopefully, well, and even we know that historically, generally, most people who did come under some kind of threat, self-defense type threat, only had 1 or 2 or 3 assailants. They didn't necessarily need to worry about having to, you know, fight all day or anything like that. So 5 or 6 shots was generally speaking enough. So carrying one of these around, and even as a deterrent, was pretty much enough. You didn't have to carry a sword around as well in addition to one of these. So if you're given the choice of do I carry a sword or do I carry on one of these, yes, ideally you'd carry both, but if you can only be bothered to carry one, you'd probably carry this, just because it's a lot easier to carry. Okay, you can stick it on your belt, or even tuck it in the top of your trousers, as was often done at the time. Not everybody bothered buying holsters. And there you go, easy to carry around, nice and inconspicuous, and you can also conceal it, of course, if you want to for some reason, which a sword you cannot really reasonably conceal it, and that's why, at least in 19th century contexts where weapons were concealed, like bowie knives or certain other types of knife, or indeed pistols, they were the weapons of choice for concealing. People didn't really try to conceal a sword because it's not really practical. So ease of carriage is a major advantage of the pistol or revolver, and it is something that I think by historians and people interested in historical weapons tends to get a little bit overlooked, but it's a major point and worth remembering. So as already mentioned, a major advantage of the pistol or revolver is of course that you can offend someone at range, but another thing that perhaps gets overlooked slightly in the 19th century context is that you can offend someone who is even through an object, and very clearly you cannot usually do this with a sword. For example, say someone's inside a house. Okay, now most houses in a lot of parts of the world at this time only had things like wattle and daub walls, or even sometimes just thin panels of wood. Obviously a door, you can shoot through a door with one of these. Obviously you can shoot through a window. Yes, you could poke a sword through a window, but you're very unlikely to hit the person the other side because they'll just move out of the way of it. So you can offend people through objects or over objects when you can't get close enough to them to offend them with a sword. You can do it with a revolver or pistol. And another incident where that is kind of true, that you wouldn't necessarily think of as an obstacle, is a shield. And there were of course some parts of the world where the person who was using a revolver or a pistol came up against someone who had a shield and another weapon, be it a sword or a spear or whatever. And we do in fact know that in some cases the person had a sword and a revolver, and they saw the enemy come at them with a shield, so they just shot straight through the shield, because very few shields will stop a shot from a revolver or a pistol. I say very few because yes, there were in fact some bulletproof shields. Relatively well-known example is the Sudanese buckler, small shield made of rhino hide, and this is very, very thick rhino skin, and it was noted that they would stop a .45 caliber bullet. So although of course you've got to remember this is a buckler sized shield, so if a person managed to block an incoming shot from a .45 revolver with their buckler, I think you'd list them as very, very lucky. And if you were a person using the revolver, you'd probably be best advised to shoot them in the legs and then shoot them in the head, and not of course aim at their buckler, which would be rather silly. Finally, whilst I listed as an advantage of the sword the fact that the sword can of course parry and defend and guard from close attacks from other weapons such as bayonets and other swords and such like, in a way this goes full circle, because one of the advantages of the revolver or the pistol is that people can't parry it once you shoot at them. Yes, okay, you might be unlucky, it might glance off a piece of their equipment, it might glance off their sword blade. And I have in fact seen an antique sword which had received a bullet right the way through the blade, so in actual fact a sword blade might not even stop the bullet. But by and large, if you shoot at someone, unless they dodge, and they've really got to start dodging before you pull that trigger, and it usually, if someone's dodged and you actually miss, it's more a case of you missing than of them successfully dodging. So by and large, an advantage of the sword is also kind of, you can say it in reverse, that an advantage of the revolver is, whilst yes you can't defend and parry with it, really, yes, okay, maybe you might be able to stick the gun in the way, but equally no one can parry it, no one can defend. Once that bullet's in the air and coming towards them, they're going to get hit by it. So there we go. We've listed the main advantages of the pistol now. I think the strongest ones, and certainly the ones which were listed as the main advantages of the pistol or revolver in the 19th century, were the fact that, number one, you can reach out and offend a target that is some distance away from you, rather than having to be next to you like with a hand weapon. But equally, when you do hit that target, generally speaking, and obviously it's not always the case, but generally speaking, bullets caused more fatalities than hand weapon wounds did in the middle of the 19th century and later in the 19th century. Partly, it has to be said, because of the state of medicine of the day and the conditions of warfare, i.e. you couldn't, generally speaking, get medical treatment to soldiers very immediately, certainly not as quickly as they do in modern warfare. So there we go, those are the main advantages of the pistol or revolver. So to sum up, the main advantage of the sword is that it can defend and never runs out of ammo, and we could say the same of course for the bayonet. And the main advantage of the pistol or revolver is that you can offend someone who is behind an obstacle or far away from you, and when you do hit them, generally speaking, they're more likely to go down than when they take a hit from a sword or a bayonet. So of course, when choosing between, if you can only have one or the other, really the choice comes down to it's a tactical decision of what type of fight you think you're going to be in. If you're going to you're in a siege, for example, something like the Siege of Delhi or Siege of Sevastopol, and you're expecting to go into a built-up area where the opponents might be quite numerous and might be at very close range, then in that situation a sword or a bayonet may very realistically be a better weapon to choose, if you can only choose one or the other, than a pistol or revolver. Equally, if you're likely to be in a large open space, or indeed sitting on a horse, where of course you can move away from the opponent and maybe have time to reload, then a pistol or a revolver may well be a far better choice. And of course, if you can see people from far away and they're in open ground, you know, you're not, say you're in sort of arid grassland or desert or whatever, then a pistol might be a better idea, because of course people aren't going to suddenly spring up on you out of nowhere and jump on you. So really, those are just two examples. Of course there are many other examples of where a pistol might be a better choice, or a sword or bayonet might be a better choice. But ultimately, in the 19th century, what I'm holding here were the officers' armaments. Certainly in most European nations' armies, in Britain and France and Germany and so on, Italy and such like. So the sword really has its own advantages, the main ones being that you can defend with it and it will always stay with you, never need reloading. The pistol's main advantage that it's pretty potent as a weapon and can reach out over a distance. So it's useful if you can have both, because they actually fulfill different tactical roles. When we get into a discussion of which is better as a close combat weapon out of one or the other, the answer really is it depends. It depends on the environment that you're fighting in and other tactical considerations. Talking about a modern environment, well, very clearly the pistol, a modern pistol with a clip of 11 or 13 rounds, however many, and if you have numerous clips, offers a huge number of advantages in most tactical situations over a knife or a bayonet. However, even in the modern world, as I mentioned at the start of the video, there are situations where the knife or the bayonet or even the hatchet, or potentially one day even swords, we never know, maybe they'll come back one day in some use in warfare, these types of bladed hand weapons do still have a place. And even as we saw in the Falklands War, for example, and indeed in Iraq and in Afghanistan, bayonets and knives do still play a part in modern warfare and do still have a place in modern warfare and are needed, because there will always be a time and a place where the pistol just won't do the job. Thanks for watching.